She did not do this. Sheriff Henry Mercer slammed his fist down on the heavy oak table so hard that the water pitcher trembled and sloshed. She did not do this, Judge Harlan, and I will prove it myself if every man in this county refuses to stand beside me. The courtroom of Caldwell, Kansas, fell into a silence so absolute that the only sound was the dry wind scraping dust across the window panes outside. It was the summer of 1879, and the heat sat over the town like a punishment from God. Margaret Barrett sat in the prisoner's dock with her wrists bound in front of her dark hair pinned back severely, her green eyes fixed on Henry with an expression that was not gratitude, not yet, because gratitude requires hope, and hope was something Margaret Barrett had stopped carrying a long time ago. Judge Clarence Harlan peered over his spectacles with the kind of irritation that only a man who considered himself deeply important could manufacture. He was 62 years old, broad through the middle, with silver whiskers and the deep-set eyes of a man who had already decided the verdict before the testimony began. "Sheriff Mercer," Harlan said, his voice rolling out like a slow wheel on gravel, "you are an officer of this court and you will conduct yourself accordingly. The evidence against this woman is substantial. We have a witness, we have a motive, and we have a body. You have a liar, a manufactured motive, and a dead man whose killer is sitting in that gallery right now watching this woman burn for his crime." Henry turned and swept his eyes across the crowded gallery, and every person he looked at found something urgent to study on the floor. He was 34 years old, tall and lean, with dark hair gone slightly gray at the temples and jawline that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone bluffs that ran along the Chicaskia River. His badge caught the light from the high windows. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale gray and very still, and when he looked at things he did not look away. Margaret had not wanted to look at him. She had been telling herself not to since the moment he walked into the jailhouse the night they arrested her, when she had been sitting in the corner of the cell with her arms wrapped around herself, and a bruise spreading yellow and purple along her left cheekbone, evidence of the struggle the prosecutor was now calling evidence of guilt. He had looked at her then the same way he was looking at her now, steady and without flinching, and she had not been able to account for the way it made her feel, which was like something tight in her chest was loosening thread by thread. "I am granting a 30-day continuance," Judge Harlan said, though he looked as if the words cost him something personal. 30 days, Sheriff. You bring me something that changes this picture and I will hear it. You fail, and we proceed to sentencing." He banged his gavel like a man driving a nail. The gallery erupted into noise and movement, and in the chaos Margaret was escorted back toward the jail by Deputy Tom Pratt, who had the decency to at least not handle her roughly. Henry stood at the front of the courtroom alone, not moving, watching her go. She turned once at the doorway because she could not help it, and their eyes met for just a moment, and she thought, "This man is either going to save my life or break my heart," and she was not certain which possibility frightened her more. "Let me take you back 3 weeks before that courtroom, to the morning everything fell apart, because you need to understand what Margaret Barrett was before all of this happened to her, and what Henry Mercer was before he decided to throw his career and his reputation into a fire for a woman he had known for less than 2 months. Margaret had come to Caldwell, Kansas in April of 1879 on the stage from Wichita, which had itself been the end of a very long journey. She was 28 years old, and she had come from St. Louis, where she had spent the previous 3 years working as a seamstress and bookkeeper for a dry goods establishment owned by a man named Clifford Raines, who was not a good man in several important respects. She had left St. Louis with $11, a small leather trunk, 2 dresses, a skill with figures that most people in frontier towns found surprising in a woman, and a secret she had been carrying for long enough that it had worn itself smooth like a river stone, no longer sharp enough to cut but always present, always weighty. She had answered an advertisement in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch placed by one Gerald Hooper, a cattle broker in Caldwell who needed a bookkeeper, and was offering a position to a reliable woman of good character. The advertisement had been careful not to be too specific about the nature of the position, and Margaret had been careful not to ask too many questions before she accepted it, which turned out to be a mutual mistake. Gerald Hooper was 53 years old, thick through the neck, with hands that had the texture of saddle leather and eyes that moved around a room too quickly, cataloging everything as either useful or worthless. He had met Margaret at the stage office in April, and he had shaken her hand with both of his and said, with the particular confidence of a man who rarely hears the word no, that she was exactly what he had been hoping for. She had spent the first week understanding that the position was less bookkeeper and more wife in all practical senses except the legal one, and she had spent the second week making her objections clearly known, and she had spent the third week looking for another way to support herself in Caldwell rather than going back to St. Louis. It was in that third week that she met Henry Mercer. She had gone to the land office to inquire about commercial leases, because she had heard that the woman who ran the millinery shop on 2nd Street was looking to bring on a partner, and she had walked directly into the middle of an argument between the land registrar, a fidgety little man named Amos Webb, and Sheriff Henry Mercer, who was attempting to explain, with visible but carefully restrained impatience, that the deed Amos was about to register had a forged signature on it. "That is the signature of James Alderton," Henry was saying when Margaret came through the door. "I know James Alderton's signature because I have seen it on 30 cattle receipts and 2 property transfers in the last 4 years, and that is not it." "The notary seal is present and correct, Sheriff," Amos said, sweating visibly. "The notary seal on a forged document makes it a forged document with a seal," Henry said, with the tone of a man explaining something to someone he had explained it to before. Margaret stood at the back of the room holding her letter of inquiry and watched the exchange with the quiet attention she brought to everything, and when Henry turned to leave and nearly walked directly into her, he stopped, and they were briefly very close, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and smell the cedar and horse's scent of him, and he said, "Pardon me, ma'am," with a sincerity that she was not accustomed to from men. "Entirely my fault," she said, and stepped aside, and he went out, and she conducted her business with the flustered Amos Webb, and that should have been the end of it. But Caldwell, Kansas in 1879 was a cattle town at the edge of the Indian Territory, and it was not a large place, and Henry Mercer was the sheriff, which meant that their paths crossed in the following days with the frequency that small towns impose on their residents regardless of personal preference. He tipped his hat to her outside the post office. He held the door of the dry goods store. He nodded to her from across the dusty width of Main Street. And then, one Wednesday evening, she was sitting in the small room she was renting above the laundry when she heard a commotion below, and looked out her window to see 2 men brawling in the alley. And she watched Henry walk into the middle of it with the unhurried calm of a man who has done this enough times that the fear has been burned clean away. And he separated them with a few sharp words and a grip on each man's collar that was absolutely authoritative, and she sat at her window for a long time after, thinking about a kind of quiet strength she had not known existed in a man, because the men she had known were either weak or aggressive and nothing in between. He came to the laundry the following afternoon. "Mrs. Barrett," he said, hat in his hands. "Miss Barrett," she corrected, because the title was a formality that some women in her position adopted and she had never been comfortable with it. "Miss Barrett," he said without any change in expression, "I understand you are looking for employment. The county needs someone to keep the records for the jail and the court filings. It pays $12 a month." He paused. "It is honest work." She looked at him for a moment. "Why are you offering this to me?" He considered the question seriously. "Because Amos Webb told me you came in asking about commercial leases, and he said you knew exactly what every form meant and asked exactly the right questions. And because I need someone who can read properly and pay attention, and because I believe you are in a difficult situation with Gerald Hooper, and I think you deserve better than the situation he has created for you." The directness of it startled her more than anything else about him, because men in her experience said what they wanted in circuitous ways and never named the truth plainly. "You are very frank," she said. "I find it saves time," he said. She took the position. The next 6 weeks were the nearest thing to contentment that Margaret Barrett had known in several years. She worked in the small office adjacent to the jailhouse, keeping records in her meticulous hand, and Henry came and went with the business of the county, and they fell into a rhythm of daily conversation that was at first professional and grew gradually and entirely without either of them planning it into something warmer and more personal. He brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked. She noticed that he took his without sugar and that he always left the last of the pot for her. She told him about St. Louis in pieces, careful pieces, leaving out the parts that were not hers to share yet. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about coming west in 1868 when he was 23, about the 3 years he had spent working cattle before the town of Caldwell hired him as deputy and eventually as sheriff. She noticed the way he moved through the world, which was with a deliberateness and a steadiness that she found both reassuring and occasionally maddening, because there were moments when she wanted him to be less composed and more human, to show the cracks, and then he would do something like bring her wildflowers he had clearly picked awkwardly from the edge of the road, and set them on her desk in the tin cup he used for pencils with no explanation whatsoever, and she would understand that the cracks were there, just expressed in ways she had to learn to read. Gerald Hooper did not take well to Margaret's departure from his employ or her continued presence in Caldwell under a different arrangement. He made his displeasure known in the particular way of men who are used to having things their own way, which is to say gradually and through channels, first through cold looks and social pressure, then through comments made at the saloon and the general store about Margaret's character and her reasons for leaving Missouri. Margaret held her head up and said nothing, and kept her work meticulous and her manner cool, and Henry watched Hooper's behavior with the still attentiveness of a man cataloging something he intends to address at the right moment. The right moment never came in the way anyone expected, because on the 14th of June, 1879, Gerald Hooper was found dead on the floor of his cattle brokerage office with a letter opener buried in his chest, and the last person anyone could place near the office that evening was Margaret Barrett. She had been there. She could not deny it. She had gone to retrieve a set of ledger books that she had kept during her brief employment with Hooper, and that she needed to demonstrate her bookkeeping qualifications for a letter of reference she was preparing. She had arrived at the office at approximately 7 in the evening and found the door unlocked, which she thought was unusual, and inside she found Gerald Hooper already dead on the floor, which was worse than unusual. She had knelt beside him in shock and had gotten blood on the hem of her dress and on her right hand before the rational part of her mind caught up with the rest of her, and she stood and backed away and then ran for the door, where she collided directly with 2 men who had heard nothing and seen nothing except a woman running from a building where a man lay dead, and there was blood on her hands in the literal and most damning sense. Henry was at the scene within 15 minutes, and when he saw Margaret in the custody of his deputy and saw the blood and saw the shock on her face and saw the body on the floor, he stood very still for a long moment in the way he did when he was thinking hard about something, and then he began to look at the room with the careful attention of a man who is not willing to accept the obvious answer. What he saw: Hooper's body on the floor with the letter opener in his chest, blood on the floor around him. A window on the east side of the office that was not quite closed all the way, though the evening had been hot and everyone had their windows open. A glass of whiskey on the desk with a lipstick mark on the rim that was not the color Margaret wore. A stack of ledger books on the edge of the desk that had been moved recently, disturbed, the dust pattern around them indicating they had been shifted, because Henry Mercer noticed things like dust patterns and a button on the floor near the window, a brass button of the kind used on the jackets favored by one Randall Cross, who was a cattle buyer from Abilene who had been in town for 3 days and who had been doing business with Hooper, and who had been seen arguing with Hooper that very afternoon about a disputed payment of some $400. He noted all of this and said nothing yet, because he was not a man who spoke before he was certain. He had Margaret taken to the jail with the quiet instruction to Tom Pratt to treat her with every courtesy, and then he spent 2 hours at the scene looking at everything, and then he went to find Randall Cross. Randall Cross had left town. Cross had taken his horse from the livery at 8:30 in the evening, which was an hour and a half after the estimated time of death, and an hour before Margaret was found with blood on her hands, and he had ridden south toward the Indian Territory, which was significant for several reasons, not least of which was that men who leave town the evening of a murder in the direction of the Indian Territory are generally leaving for reasons they do not want examined. Henry went to the jailhouse. Margaret was sitting in the cell in the corner, and when he came in, she looked at him with those green eyes, and he saw in them a terror that she was working very hard to contain, and something else beneath the terror that looked like resignation, like a woman who has been handed bad luck before and knows better than to be surprised by it. And something about that particular combination made his chest feel like a hand had closed around it and squeezed. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said, sitting down on the bench outside the cell so that he was at her level rather than standing over her, which was a small thing but not an accident. She told him everything. She was precise and she was calm and she did not embellish and she did not leave anything out, and he listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she was done he sat quietly for a moment. "There was a glass on Hooper's desk with a lipstick mark on it," he said. "What color do you wear?" She blinked at the unexpectedness of the question. "I do not wear any. I cannot afford it and I never acquired the habit." He nodded slowly. "I thought so." "Did you see anyone when you arrived at the building?" "No one. The street was quiet. There was a horse tied at the post on the south side of the building that I did not recognize, a gray with a white stocking on the left foreleg." What kind of post on the horse's saddle, she thought. There was a rifle scabbard, and the saddle blanket was red, a dark red with a black stripe along the edge. Henry knew that saddle blanket. He had seen it on Randall Cross's horse at the livery that morning. He stood up. "I am going to get you out of this," he said. "You cannot promise that," she said quietly. "No," he said, "I cannot promise it, but I am going to do it anyway." The next morning, Deputy Tom Pratt came to Henry's office with the news that Clifford Pemberton, a local rancher who had a long-standing and complicated financial relationship with Gerald Hooper, had come forward to say he had seen Margaret Barrett going into Hooper's office at 7 o'clock and had heard shouting from inside. Henry asked Pratt what kind of shouting, and Pratt said Pemberton had described it as a woman's voice. And Henry said, with the particular quiet that preceded his most dangerous moods, that Clifford Pemberton had better be very certain about what he heard, because giving false witness in a murder case was a serious business. Pratt reported this back to Pemberton, who confirmed his statement with an enthusiasm that suggested he had already committed to it too publicly to retreat. Henry went to find out who Clifford Pemberton owed money to, and discovered it was Gerald Hooper's estate, which was now in the hands of Hooper's business partner, one Franklin de Lacy, who had been conspicuously absent from Caldwell on the evening of the murder, and had returned the following morning with a calm that Henry found instructive. The picture was clarifying. Hooper had been killed by someone who wanted him dead and who needed a convenient suspect, and Margaret Barrett, newly arrived in town, briefly employed by the victim, seen near the premises, female and therefore easy to dismiss as hysterical and guilty, had been the most convenient suspect available. The orchestration of it was not sophisticated, but it did not need to be sophisticated in a world where the default assumption about a woman in the wrong place at the wrong time ran heavily toward guilt. Henry went to see Judge Harlan and requested a delay in the preliminary hearing. Harlan, who had a reputation for impatience and a fondness for efficiency, granted a week. Henry used the week to do the following things. He sent a telegraph to the U.S. Marshal's office in Wichita describing Randall Cross and requesting assistance in locating him. He interviewed 6 people on the street where Hooper's office stood and found 2 of them who had noticed the gray horse with the white stocking and the red saddle blanket tied outside. He found the woman whose lip color matched the mark on the whiskey glass, a woman named Clara Sims who worked at the Silver Bell Saloon and who had been coerced into providing a false alibi for someone and was now terrified. And he went through Hooper's ledger books, the ones that had been moved on the desk the night of the murder, and found in them evidence of a financial arrangement between Hooper, DeLacy, and Pemberton that had gone very badly wrong, involving cattle that had never been delivered and money that had been moved through the books in ways designed to hide its ultimate destination. The financial picture told a story. Hooper had been skimming from DeLacy. DeLacy had discovered this recently. The dispute between Hooper and Cross, the Abilene cattle buyer, had been manufactured by DeLacy as a distraction, and Cross had likely been hired or coerced to perform a service that had ended Hooper's life, leaving DeLacy with the business, the books, and Pemberton as a witness to point the finger elsewhere. It was elegant in its way, Henry thought, but it had left too many edges. He went to see Clara Sims. Clara Sims was 26 years old with the kind of tired beauty that comes from working in a saloon in a cattle town, and when Henry came to see her at the Silver Bell, she took him to the storage room in the back and closed the door, and then stood with her arms crossed and her jaw set in the way of someone who is both frightened and furious, and has not yet decided which to let win. "I am not going to ask you to do anything that puts you in danger," Henry said, which was the first thing, because it was the most important thing. "I need to understand what you know and what you were told, and then I need to figure out how to use that information in a way that keeps you safe." She studied him for a moment. "Franklin DeLacy told me there would be trouble for me if I said anything about where I was that night." "Franklin DeLacy is going to be in prison," Henry said. "That changes the mathematics." "You are very sure of yourself," she said. "I am sure of the evidence," he said. "Those are different things." She told him everything. She had been in Hooper's office at approximately 6:15 in the evening, brought there by a note she had received supposedly from Hooper requesting a meeting about a private matter. She had waited for 20 minutes, during which Hooper had not appeared, and had drunk a glass of his whiskey out of irritation, and then left. She had passed a man on the stairs going up as she was going down, a man she knew as someone who worked for DeLacy, a man named Pike Harmon who drove cattle for DeLacy's operation. She had not thought anything of it at the time. She thought considerably more of it now. "Would you be willing to testify to this?" Henry asked. "Would it actually help that woman, the one they arrested?" "Yes," Henry said. Clara looked at the closed door of the storage room for a long moment. "I have been in this town for 4 years and nobody has ever done right by me when it counted," she said. "But yes, I will testify." That was the evening before the hearing at which Henry had stood up in the courtroom and declared, with every eye in Caldwell upon him, that Margaret Barrett did not do this and he would prove it himself. He went to the jail after the hearing was over. Margaret was brought back to the cell, and she sat down carefully on the narrow cot and folded her hands in her lap and waited, because she had learned long ago that waiting was one of the few things she could always do, even when everything else was taken from her. Henry came in and sat on the bench again and looked at her. 30 days, he said. "I heard," she said. "I have most of what I need," he said. "I am waiting on the marshal's office to locate Randall Cross, and I have a witness who can place Pike Harmon at the building that evening, and the ledger books tell a story that Harlan is not going to be able to ignore." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet that meant he was being careful with something. "Because you did not do it," he said. "That is not an answer to the question I asked," she said. He looked at her steadily. "No," he admitted. "It is not," she waited. "Because," he said, and stopped and started again. "Because you deserve someone to stand up for you, and because I am in a position to do it. And because he stopped again. "Henry," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without the formal title, and it sat in the air between them like something new. He looked at her with those pale gray eyes that did not flinch. "Because somewhere in the last 6 weeks I have become very much concerned with what happens to you," he said, "and I am aware that it is not entirely professional." She did not say anything for a moment. Outside, the wind moved across Caldwell, and the dust rose and settled and rose again. And somewhere on Main Street, a horse whickered, and someone's door banged in its frame. "I need you to know something," she said finally, because she had been carrying the river stone long enough, and she did not think she could let him stand up for her in a courtroom without telling him at least part of the truth. "The reason I left St. Louis, there is something I have not told you." "You do not have to tell me anything," he said. "I want to," she said, which surprised her as she said it, because wanting to tell someone the truth had not been a feeling she had experienced in quite a while. She told him about Clifford Raines, the dry goods man in St. Louis, who had not been a good employer in several important ways. She told him about the year she had worked for Raines and the mistake she had made in trusting someone who presented himself as trustworthy. And she told him about the consequence of that mistake, which was a child who had been born and had lived for 4 days and then had not, which was the piece of herself she carried like a river stone everywhere she went, and which was why she had left St. Louis, because she could not continue to exist in a city that held that weight. She told him all of this plainly and without flinching, the way she told everything, looking at her folded hands on her lap. When she looked up, he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read, and then she read it, and it was not judgment and it was not pity, which were the two things she had been braced for. It was something closer to grief, the clean grief of one person understanding another person's pain. "I am sorry," he said. "I am very sorry that happened to you." She nodded once tight. "It does not change anything about what I told you," he said, "or anything I am going to do." She believed him. That was the remarkable thing. Standing at the edge of everything falling apart, she believed him. The days that followed were a particular kind of agony because she was in a jail cell in Caldwell, Kansas, and Henry was out in the county, and the wider world doing the work of proving she was innocent. And she had nothing to do but wait and think and watch the light change in the small window above her head. Tom Pratt was decent enough and brought her books from the Caldwell library, which was really just a shelf in the back of the hardware store, and the 2 novels and 1 agricultural almanac he provided were not precisely what she would have chosen, but she read them all 3 times. She had a small sewing project that Mrs. Pratt, Tom's wife, brought her, a shirt she was making for nobody in particular, and she worked on it in the long afternoons when the heat pressed through the walls of the jailhouse. And every evening, Henry came and sat on the bench outside the cell and told her what he had found that day. This is how she fell in love with him. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of those evenings, in the way he came back every day without fail, in the way he reported his findings not as victories or as reassurances designed to calm her down, but as information shared between equals, the way he assumed she could handle the truth even when the truth was complicated. He told her about Clara Sims and about the ledger discrepancies and about the telegraph he was waiting on from Wichita. He told her about Clifford Pemberton's financial relationship with Hooper's estate and what he thought it meant. He told her about the 2 witnesses who had seen the gray horse outside Hooper's building, and how one of them had also seen a man going in the back entrance whom he had not been able to identify clearly, but who he was now fairly certain was Pike Harmon. And sometimes, when the business of the case was exhausted, they talked about other things. She told him about her childhood in Illinois, about the farm her father had worked until the drought took it, about her mother who had made extraordinary pies and had never once made Margaret feel like a burden even during the years when they had very little. He told her about his brother in Missouri who had a farm and 6 children, and who wrote Henry long letters requesting that he find a decent woman and settle down, which made her smile in a way she had not expected. "What do you want?" she asked him one evening, and the question was broader than just the case, and they both knew it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. "I want to sleep without worrying about the next thing that is going to come apart," he said. "I want to have somewhere to come home to that is more than a room above a hardware store. He looked up. "I want things I am not going to say to a woman in a jail cell." "When I am out of the jail cell," she said. "When you are out of the jail cell," he agreed. On the 18th day, the telegraph from Wichita came. The U.S. Marshal's office had located Randall Cross in a town called Medicine Lodge, 60 miles to the west. Cross had been picked up on an unrelated charge, a brawl that had damaged a saloon, and he was being held in the county jail there. Henry arranged with the marshal's office to have Cross transported to Caldwell for questioning, and then Henry rode out to Medicine Lodge himself, because he did not want to trust anything about this to anyone else. He returned on the 21st day with Randall Cross in custody, and Cross was not a stupid man. And when he understood the full picture of his situation, which was that he had been used as a convenient distraction by DeLacy, while DeLacy's man Pike Harmon did the actual work, Cross was willing to talk at considerable length. He had been paid by DeLacy to make a public argument with Hooper about the disputed $400, which he had done, and had been told to leave town that evening, which he had also done, and had thought at the time that he was being hired to provide cover for some kind of theft from Hooper's office rather than the actual murder of the man. He had not asked enough questions, he admitted, because the money had been sufficient to discourage questions. He was now asking all the questions he should have asked before, primarily the one about how much time he would serve if he cooperated fully. Henry took this to Judge Harlan on the 23rd day. Harlan listened to all of it for a very long time, the ledger evidence, Cross's statement, Clara Sims's testimony that she had been in the office before the murder and had passed Pike Harmon on the stairs, and the two witnesses who had seen the gray horse with the red saddle blanket at the building. He listened with the stiff posture of a man who is revising a conclusion he has publicly committed to, which is uncomfortable work. "Where is Harmon now?" Harlan asked. "Working DeLacy's cattle operation 20 miles south," Henry said. "I would like authorization to bring him in. And DeLacy, I would like that authorization as well." Harlan tapped his fingers on his desk. He was a complicated man, Harlan. Not essentially corrupt, but not particularly motivated by justice either. Motivated more by order and efficiency. And the order of his court had been disrupted by Henry's announcement, and by the inconvenient accumulation of evidence that he now had to account for. He looked at Henry with the particular expression of a man conducting an internal negotiation. "You have done thorough work, Sheriff," he said finally, which was the closest thing to an apology the situation was going to produce. "I had thorough reasons," Henry said. He rode out to DeLacy's ranch with Tom Pratt and 2 additional deputies he had borrowed from the neighboring county, because he was not reckless, whatever else could be said about him. The arrest of Pike Harmon was not complicated because Harmon was a practical man who could see when a situation was concluded and chose not to compound his difficulties with violence. The arrest of Franklin DeLacy was more complicated because DeLacy attempted to resist and had to be persuaded firmly, but it was accomplished without anyone being seriously hurt, and Henry brought both men into Caldwell on the morning of the 24th day. He went to the jailhouse. Tom Pratt unlocked the cell and stepped back, and Margaret stood up and walked out of the cell and into the office, and she was thinner than she had been, and there were shadows under her eyes from a month of poor sleep, and she was wearing the same dress she had been wearing the night of her arrest, which had been laundered and pressed by Mrs. Pratt but still showed the faint ghost of what had happened to the hem. Henry stood in the middle of the office and looked at her. She looked at him. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he said. "Harlan will make it formal tomorrow with a full dismissal of the charges, but you are free right now." She stood very still for a moment, and he watched something move across her face that was not a single emotion, but several arriving at once: relief and exhaustion, and something that looked very much like the particular vulnerability of a person who has been strong for so long that the absence of the need to be strong is itself almost destabilizing. She pressed her lips together, and she lifted her chin in the way she had, and she did not quite succeed in not crying, which he found he had no interest in pretending not to notice. He crossed the room and he put his arms around her, which was something he had been wanting to do for considerably longer than he would have been comfortable admitting, and she stood rigid for just a moment, and then she leaned against him, and she was shaking slightly in the way of someone who has been holding themselves together through an act of continuous will and is now being allowed to stop, and he held her steadily and said nothing, because there was nothing to say and she did not need words. She needed the holding. After a while she straightened and stepped back and looked up at him with eyes that were wet and entirely clear at the same time, which was entirely characteristic. "I believe you said you had things to say when I was out of the jail cell," she said. The corner of his mouth moved in the way that served him for a smile when the full version seemed excessive. "I did say that," he said. "I have been in the jail cell for 24 days, she said. "It seems reasonable to say the things now." He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that did not flinch. "I love you," he said. "I have been aware of that fact for some time. I have also been aware that the timing of saying so was complicated by the circumstances, and I did not want to say it in a way that you would hear as motivated by anything other than what it is." "Which is?" she said. "The simple fact," he said. "No hidden motives, no conditions. I love you and I would like very much for you to stay in Caldwell." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the jailhouse, the town of Caldwell continued its business. The sound of horses and a wagon and someone calling across the street, the ordinary sounds of a place that had briefly held her trapped and was now releasing her back into the ordinary afternoon. "I have not allowed myself to want things for a long time," she said. "I have been very practical about what is available and what is not, and I have tried not to want what is not available. And then she stopped. "And then I what?" he said. "And then you walked into that courtroom and told the judge that you would prove it yourself," she said. "And I did not know until that moment how long it had been since anyone had stood up for me like that, since anyone had looked at me and seen something worth standing up for." He looked at her steadily. "You are worth standing up for," he said, with the simplicity of a man stating something he considers self-evident. She closed the distance between them and she kissed him, which was not something she had planned but which was, she discovered, exactly correct. And he kissed her back with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, careful and entirely present and not brief. When they separated, she had both hands on his chest and could feel his heartbeat, which was not as steady as he looked. "I would like to stay in Caldwell," she said. "I would like that very much." The formal dismissal of charges came the following morning in Judge Harlan's courtroom, which was smaller and less dramatic than the previous hearing had been, because most of the gallery had not been informed of the development and the room held only the principals, which was fine with Margaret. Harlan read the dismissal in a flat voice that suggested he was doing it correctly rather than enthusiastically, and he looked at Margaret once over his spectacles and said, without precisely apologizing, that he hoped she would find Caldwell a hospitable place, which was the closest he was going to get, and she accepted it with her chin up and her face composed. Clifford Pemberton, faced with the full weight of the evidence against him and the specific testimony of 2 witnesses to his false account, made a deal with the prosecutor and provided a complete statement in exchange for reduced charges. His statement confirmed everything Henry had established and added the detail that DeLacy had personally instructed him on what to say and when to say it, and that he had been given $200 for his cooperation, which had been intended to go toward the debt he owed to Hooper's estate. Pike Harmon went to trial in September and was convicted of the murder of Gerald Hooper and sentenced to hang, which he was, On the 5th of October, 1879, which was a cold, clear day in Caldwell with the wind coming down from the north, and Henry performed his duty as sheriff without visible emotion, and Margaret did not attend. Franklin de Lacy was tried separately and convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and several counts of fraud relating to the ledger manipulations, and he was sentenced to 15 years in the Kansas State Penitentiary at Lansing, which was not what Henry would have called full justice, but was what the law provided for, and he accepted it because he was, at his core, a man who believed in the law even when it was imperfect. Randall Cross received a reduced sentence for his cooperation, 1 year in the county jail, and left Caldwell afterward and was not heard of again in that part of Kansas. Clara Sims testified at both trials with the particular courage of a woman who has decided that being afraid is less important than being right, and her testimony was essential, and her manner on the stand was composed and credible, and Henry made sure that the prosecutor treated her with respect, which he did, because Henry had made clear that how he was regarded in the county depended in part on how this case was conducted. After the trials, Clara left the Silver Bell and opened a small dressmaker's shop on 2nd Street, which thrived, because she had a talent for it that the saloon work had never given her the opportunity to develop. The autumn of 1879 was the most remarkable season Margaret Barrett had experienced since the good years on her family's farm, before the drought took everything. She worked in the county record's office, and she walked Caldwell's Main Street without the weight of the previous months on her, and she and Henry spent their evenings in the growing certainty of each other, in the particular sweetness of two people who have been through something real together, and come out the other side with the knowledge of what the other is made of. He took her riding on the Sunday afternoons when his duties permitted, out onto the flat country south of town, where the Chicaskia ran in its shallow bed, and the grass moved in long waves in the autumn wind. She had ridden as a child on the farm in Illinois and had not in the years since, and she was tentative at first and then more confident, and he rode beside her without instructing her unless she asked, which she found she appreciated. On one of those Sunday afternoons, sitting on the bank of the river with the horses grazing at a little distance, and the light going orange and long across the Kansas plain, he asked her to marry him. He did it with the same plainness with which he did everything. He did not get down on his knee, which she had half expected, but turned to her and said, "Margaret, I want to marry you. I want us to have a proper life. I want you to have the permanence and the safety you deserve, not because you need saving, but because you deserve good things and I want to be one of them. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a moment, this man who had stood up in a courtroom and told a judge and a crowd of strangers that he would prove her innocent himself, this man who came every evening without fail and shared information with her as though she were capable of handling it, which she was, this man who had held her when she finally allowed herself to stop being entirely composed. This man who brought flowers in a pencil cup and rode beside her without unwanted instruction and said what he meant in direct words without circling around it. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." They were married in November of 1879 in the Caldwell Methodist Church, which was a small building that smelled of pine boards and candle wax and had been recently painted white on the outside so that it stood against the gray November sky with a kind of earnest brightness. The minister was a young man named Reverend Carey, who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Tom Pratt stood up with Henry. Clara Sims stood with Margaret, which felt right and true, and Henry had thought it was the right choice when Margaret suggested it, and had said so. Mrs. Pratt cried. The two witnesses who had testified about the gray horse were there, and a handful of other Caldwell residents who had come to know Margaret in her months in the town. Margaret wore a dress she had made herself over the previous 6 weeks from blue wool that she had selected at the dry goods store with the particular precision of a woman who knows what she is doing, and Henry wore his best suit with the badge removed from the lapel because this was not a day of official duties. And when she walked up the aisle of the small church and he saw her, the careful composure of his face shifted just slightly into something open and unguarded. And she thought that expression was worth more than any amount of ceremony. The winter settled over Caldwell with a particular gentleness that year. The first real cold came in December, and with it a snow that lay over the prairie like a held breath. And Margaret and Henry's house, which was a proper house, 2 stories of wood-frame construction on the edge of town with a front porch and a kitchen garden that would be planted in the spring, was warm with the iron stove in the kitchen and the smaller one in the parlor, and they were warm in it together. She kept the county records and took on additional work as a bookkeeper for 2 of the town's merchants, because she was not a woman designed for idleness, and her precision with figures was something the merchants valued and paid for accordingly. Henry kept the county's peace and mentored Tom Pratt and wrote letters to his brother in Missouri, who replied with very great enthusiasm about the news of the marriage and a request to visit in the spring. The brother, whose name was James, came in April of 1880 with his wife Eleanor and their youngest 2 children, because the other 4 were too old or too occupied to travel. James was like Henry in the basic shape of his face, and unlike him in almost every other way, louder and more demonstrative and given to strong opinions expressed at length, and Margaret liked him immediately. Eleanor was a quiet, observant woman who sat next to Margaret on the front porch the second afternoon of the visit and said, without preamble, "You are exactly what I hoped for when he finally found someone. I was beginning to worry he was going to be alone all his life." "He is very good at being alone," Margaret observed. "He was very good at it," Eleanor agreed. "He is better at not being alone. You can see it in him." Margaret could see it. It was not anything dramatic, but it was there. A loosening, a deeper ease, the way a person looks when the thing they did not know they needed has turned out to be exactly right. The spring of 1880 was full of planting and work and the ordinary business of a county town, cattle trailing north and commerce, and the occasional dispute that required the sheriff's attention. Henry dealt with it all with the same steady authority that had always characterized him, but he came home in the evenings now, and the home was not a room above a hardware store but a place that was built around the 2 of them, that smelled of coffee and the herbs Margaret grew in pots on the kitchen windowsill, and occasionally of fresh paint when she decided a wall needed updating. In June, Margaret told him that she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning before he left for the office, standing in the kitchen with her coffee, and she watched his face carefully when she said it, because she wanted to see it without any defenses up, and what she saw was something luminous, which was the only word she could find for it, a kind of unguarded brightness in those pale gray eyes that she had not seen before in quite that form. He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on her face very gently and looked at her for a moment and said, "Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," she said. "I want to be sure," he said, meaning, she understood, that he knew about the previous grief she carried and did not want to be insensitive to it. "Henry," she said, "I am happy. I am genuinely, fully happy, and I did not know until right now that those words were going to be available to me today." He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and held her with the same steadiness with which he held everything, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had not known until she met this man that strength and gentleness were not opposites, but rather the same quality expressed in different registers. The pregnancy was not easy in the middle months, summer in Kansas being a particular challenge when one's internal temperature regulation is already compromised. But Margaret was not a woman who complained without purpose, and she managed the heat and the discomfort with her characteristic organization and the help of Mrs. Pratt, who had raised 4 children and had practical opinions about all of it, and the counsel of Dr. Albrecht, who was the Caldwell physician, a careful German man of 50 who had studied in Europe and who treated his patients with a thoroughness that Margaret respected. Henry hovered in the specific way of a man who wants to help, and is not entirely certain what helping looks like in this context. He carried things without being asked. He took over the kitchen garden entirely. He left early and came home earlier than he used to. Margaret tolerated the hovering with the patient affection of a woman who understands that it comes from love and not from any assumption about her capacity. On the 14th of February, 1881, which was a cold, clear morning with the frost on the window glass making patterns like ferns, Margaret's son was born. He was born in the house on the edge of town with Dr. Albrecht present and Mrs. Pratt and Henry, who had refused to be anywhere else despite Dr. Albrecht's raised eyebrow, and who sat outside the bedroom door through the hardest hours with his hands clasped between his knees in a stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness, more tightly held, more full of something. And when the sound changed inside the room and then there was a new voice, very small and very indignant at the outside world, he sat very still for a different reason. Mrs. Pratt came to the door. "A boy," she said, "healthy, she is asking for you." Margaret was sitting up against the pillows looking as she always looked, composed and clear-eyed, but with an openness in her face that was newer than that had been growing since November of 1879 and was now, it seemed to Henry, complete in some way, or perhaps not complete, but arrived at a fullness that had not been there before. She was holding the baby, who was very red and was squinting at the world with the suspicion of someone who has just arrived somewhere unfamiliar. Henry sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them, and he was aware that he was not managing his expression with his usual care, that whatever was on his face was entirely visible, and that he did not mind. "Hello," Margaret said, and it was not clear whether she was speaking to him or to the baby, and he thought perhaps both. "Hello," he said. They named him Samuel James. Samuel for no particular reason except that they both liked the weight of it, and James for Henry's brother, which pleased James considerably when he received the letter. Samuel was a demanding infant who had opinions about his schedule, and expressed them with great clarity, and who had Henry's gray eyes from very early on, and Margaret's precision with everything, a characteristic that was visible even in infancy in the specific way he examined things that were put in front of him. The town of Caldwell grew around them in the way that Kansas towns grew in those years, steadily, and with the particular ambition of a place that believed in its own future. New buildings went up on Main Street. The cattle trade brought money and people, and the trouble that attends both. Henry managed it all, re-elected as sheriff in the fall of 1880 by a margin that reflected his reputation, which had been considerably enhanced by the events of the previous year. The story of how he had stood up in the courtroom and declared Margaret's innocence, and then gone out and proved it had settled into the town's memory as something worth remembering. A story told in the way that good stories are told, with the essential facts preserved, and the emotional truth kept accurate even as the details shift. Margaret's bookkeeping practice continued to grow, and she took on 2 more merchants, and then the small bank that opened on 2nd Street in 1881, whose manager, a cautious man named Mr. Fellows, had heard of her precision and made her an offer that was financially better than everything else combined. She accepted it and reorganized the bank's records in 3 weeks and implemented an accounting system that Fellows described, in a letter of reference he would later write for her, as the most logical he had seen outside of St. Louis. Clara Sims's dressmaking shop was doing well, and she had taken on an apprentice, a young woman who had come to Caldwell from the Indian Territory with nothing and who had talent. Clara came to dinner at the house on the edge of town occasionally, and she and Margaret had the friendship that forms between women who have been through something difficult together and come out on the other side with a mutual respect. Samuel took his first steps on a Tuesday in October of 1881, 17 months old, launching himself from the edge of the kitchen table toward his father with the absolute confidence of someone who has not yet learned that falling is an option. Henry caught him. He held him up, and Samuel grabbed his nose with the editorial authority of a small person who has an opinion about everything. And Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and watched them with the expression she wore when she was feeling something she did not have a word for yet. In the spring of 1882, on a Sunday afternoon when they were riding south of town in the way they still did when his duties permitted, she told him that Samuel was going to have a sibling. He turned his horse to look at her, and the Kansas light was coming across the flat land from the west, and it was on his face, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that did not flinch, and he said, "Are you happy?" "Very," she said. "Good," he said, and rode alongside her and took her hand across the space between the horses, which was not entirely practical but was entirely intentional. The second child, a daughter they named Ruth Eleanor, after both of their mothers, came in December of 1882, and she was a different creature from Samuel in every particular, quieter and more watchful and deeply interested in everything she could reach, which from very early on was more than her parents anticipated. She had Margaret's green eyes and Henry's dark hair, and the combined stubbornness of both parents concentrated in a form that was compact and very determined. Samuel regarded Ruth with the benign tolerance of an older sibling who has not entirely made up his mind about the situation. And then, when she began to be old enough to follow him around with the adoration of a younger child for an older one, he revised this to protectiveness, which Margaret thought was one of the more endearing developments of the decade. The years moved in the way that good years move, marked not by catastrophe, but by the accumulation of ordinary things that are not ordinary at all if you pay attention. Henry read to the children in the evenings from whatever books the Caldwell Library, now a proper library in its own building, had available, and Margaret taught them figures before they went to school, because she could not help it, and the kitchen table was frequently covered in chalk sums and problems that she set them for the practice of it. Samuel had a gift for it. Ruth had a gift for everything, but was particularly interested in horses and in fixing things, which Henry encouraged on both counts because he was not a man who thought that what a person could be should be limited by what they were. In 1884, when Samuel was 3 and Ruth was 1, Henry was approached about running for county sheriff with an expanded territory, which would have been a significant advancement. He came home and talked to Margaret about it the evening of the approach, not telling her what he had decided, but asking what she thought, genuinely, and they talked about it for 2 evenings, and he decided not to run, because the expanded territory would take him away from Caldwell for long stretches and away from them, and that was not a trade he was willing to make. He remained the Caldwell sheriff and was content with it, and the man who had approached him, a county commissioner named Walsh, told him later that he was a fool to pass it up, and Henry said he supposed Walsh was right from one angle and he was right from another. What Margaret thought about this and what she told him was that she would have supported whatever he decided, because his work was important and she knew it, but that she was glad, because she had gotten used to having him present and she thought the children had as well, and that she believed there was no shame in wanting to stay in the place where your life was good. No shame at all, he agreed. Judge Harlan retired in 1883 and was replaced by a younger man named Judge Thorne, who was less efficient and more just, which Henry considered an improvement. Thorne had heard the story of the Barrett case, as everyone in the county had, and he treated Henry with a particular respect that suggested he understood what that year had demonstrated about the man's character. He and Henry developed a professional relationship that was occasionally argumentative, because they had different views on several legal questions, and was mutually respectful for precisely the same reason. In 1885, Samuel started school in the stone schoolhouse that had been built on the north end of Caldwell's Main Street, and he went with the air of a person attending an event he has been anticipating and intends to be very good at. His teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Garfield, wrote a note home in October of the first year saying that Samuel had the best head for numbers she had taught in 8 years of teaching, and asking whether his parents might consider sending him to the academy in Wichita when he was older. Henry and Margaret looked at this note across the dinner table and then at each other. "That is something to think about when the time comes," Henry said. "Yes," Margaret said, in the tone that meant she had already begun thinking about it. Ruth, who could not start school for another 2 years but who had strong opinions about the situation, said that she was going to school too, and when informed that she would need to wait, expressed her position on this with a directness that her father described privately to Margaret as entirely hereditary, and which Margaret did not dispute. The house on the edge of town had by 1885 acquired a vegetable garden that took up the entire south side of the property, Margaret's doing, and a small workshop at the back where Henry repaired things, because he had always been good with his hands, and had more time for it since the county had grown law-abiding enough to allow him some hours. The front porch had a swing that he had made himself, and that was used every evening in the warm months, sometimes by both of them together in the early quiet after the children were in bed, when the town sounds came softly over the plain, and the stars over Kansas were the particular abundance that you can only see when there is no other light for 100 miles. In the evenings on that porch, they talked about everything and sometimes about nothing, which is the particular luxury of two people who have the kind of ease together that comes not from avoiding difficulty, but from having gone through it and come out knowing what the other person is made of. He told her things he had not told anyone else. She told him things she had once thought she would carry alone forever. The river stone she had carried from St. Louis had not disappeared. That weight was never entirely gone, but it had found a place in a life full enough that it was no longer the only thing she was carrying, and that was something she had not known to hope for in the hard years. She told him once, on a summer evening when the children were in bed and the plains were going purple in the last light, that she had not believed when she came to Caldwell on that stage from Wichita in April of 1879 that the place had anything for her beyond a temporary arrangement, that she had been so accustomed to things falling apart that she had stopped imagining anything else. "And now," he said. She looked at him. "Now I cannot imagine being anywhere else," she said, "or being anyone other than who I am here, with you." He put his arm around her on the porch swing, and she leaned against him with the ease of something that has been done 1,000 times and never become less. And they sat like that in the last of the light until the dark came over Caldwell, and the lamps needed lighting, and the ordinary evening proceeded. By 1886, Samuel was 5 and Ruth was 3, and the house on the edge of town was pleasantly full and frequently loud, and Margaret had the thought on a number of occasions that this was the most alive she had ever felt, the weight and the warmth and the texture of a life that was genuinely hers, built on the choice she had made, and the man she had chosen, and the town that had first nearly destroyed her and then become home. Henry came home one afternoon in March of 1886 with a look that Margaret recognized as the look he wore when he was processing something complicated. "Tell me," she said, without preamble, setting down the ledger she was working on. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table. "I have been offered a position," he said, "not county sheriff, U.S. Marshal's position covering the federal jurisdiction in this part of Kansas. It came from Judge Thorne's recommendation." He paused. "It is important work. The territory needs it, but it would mean—" "What would it mean?" she said, because she wanted the full picture. "It would mean more travel, not continuously, but some, and more responsibility. And the work it is the kind of work I believe in." He looked at her with the directness he always used when the stakes were real. "I told them I needed to talk to you first, not because I cannot decide. Because this is your life as much as mine, and I will not make decisions about our life without you." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had made her believe in directness by practicing it himself, who had built their life on the principle that she could handle the truth, who had stood up in a courtroom for her when standing up had cost him something. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to do it," he said. "I believe it is the right work." But not at the cost of, he gestured, not quite articulating it. "Take it," she said. "Take it, Henry. I have managed harder things than some additional travel. We have Mrs. Pratt. We have Clara. We have a life here that is stable and good and can manage your absence when your work requires it." She paused. "And I want you to have the work that matters to you. That has always been what I want." He looked at her with those gray eyes. "You are remarkable," he said. "I know," she said, not without humor. He accepted the marshal's position, and it took some adjusting, the longer absences, the different quality of worry that attended federal work. But they adjusted, because they were people who had proven they could manage real things, and the adjustment was, in the scheme of everything they had been through, manageable. He wrote her letters when he was away that were precise and detailed and warm in the specific way of a man who is not given to extravagance but who knows what matters. And she wrote him letters back that were equally precise and occasionally funny, because she had a dry humor that had developed in their years together into something she deployed deliberately. And he wrote back when she made him laugh and said so, which she found satisfying. Samuel was sent to the academy in Wichita in the fall of 1889, when he was 8 years old, which was young but within the range of what the academy accepted for exceptional students. And he went with the packed trunk and the serious expression of someone approaching a significant undertaking. And Henry and Margaret stood on the platform at the Caldwell train station and watched the train pull away. And Margaret kept her face very composed, and Henry's jaw was set in the specific way that meant he was feeling something he was not going to express immediately. When the train was out of sight, she looked at him. He looked at her. "He will be fine," she said. "He will be exceptional," Henry said, which was different from fine, which she understood. "He will be both," she said, and took his hand, and they walked back to the house together through the September morning of Caldwell, Kansas. Ruth, who was 7 that fall and had been attending the Caldwell school for a year, filled the house with what she always filled it with, which was questions and projects, and the specific energy of a person who is interested in everything, and has not yet found the limits of her own ability, which Henry had formed the private conviction she would spend her entire life not quite finding, and which he considered one of the finest things about her. In the spring of 1890, on an evening that was warm enough to sit on the porch without the winter coats for the first time that year, Margaret told Henry that there was going to be a third child. He looked at her across the porch swing with an expression that she had learned in 11 years of marriage to read as completely surprise, followed by something luminous, followed by the specific concerned warmth of a man who has learned to pay attention. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "Are you happy?" he said. "Extraordinarily," she said. He took her hand and held it in his large, steady one, the hand that had held her in the jailhouse, the hand that had made the porch swing and fixed the workshop and caught Samuel on his first steps. And they sat on the porch in the spring evening, and the Kansas plains went out around them in every direction under the wide sky, and the lights of Caldwell were warm behind them. And she thought, not for the first time but perhaps with the most clarity yet, that she had been given something extraordinary by this life, this man, this specific collection of choices and chances, and one very determined sheriff who had stood up in a courtroom and refused to let the wrong answer stand. The third child, a boy they named William Henry, arrived in October of 1890 on a morning with a blue October sky over Caldwell and the cottonwoods turning gold along the river. He was a large, healthy baby with dark hair and green eyes that combined his parents into something new, which was what children do, and he announced himself with the particular conviction of someone who intends to be noticed, which Ruth found amusing and Samuel was informed of by letter, and replied to with the seriousness of an older brother establishing his position. Henry held William in the way he had held the other two, with the same careful strength, the same full attention, and looked at Margaret over the baby's dark head, and she looked back at him, And they were, in that moment, simply two people who loved each other and had built a life they both wanted, which is not a small thing, which is in fact everything. Caldwell grew through the 1890s into something more established, less purely frontier, with a proper newspaper and a library with actual books, and a hotel on Main Street that had indoor plumbing by 1895. The cattle drives that had been the lifeblood of the town in the 1870s and 1880s diminished as the railroads extended, and the open range gave way to fenced land, and Caldwell adapted, as towns that survive do, by finding new purposes. Henry's work as U.S. Marshal kept pace with the changing territory, the challenges different from the raw frontier justice of 1879, but no less real. Samuel finished the academy in Wichita and went on to study law, which had surprised no one who knew him, and came home to Caldwell in 1895 to read law with a local attorney named Briggs, who recognized in him the kind of ability you do not see often and treated him accordingly. Ruth, who had reached the age of 12 with her mother's precision and her father's directness, and a talent for everything mechanical that was entirely her own, announced at the dinner table one evening that she intended to become a physician, and there was a moment of silence around the table, and then Henry said, with complete calm, "Then we will need to find out what preparation is required." And Margaret said, "I believe there are women's medical colleges in Philadelphia and in New York." And Ruth looked at both of them, and something in her face softened with the particular relief of a person who has expected to have to fight for something, and has not had to. She did go to medical college, eventually, in 1900, which is getting ahead of the story slightly, and she did become a physician, which surprised some people in Kansas and did not surprise her parents in the slightest. William, the youngest, had his mother's ease with figures and his father's instinct for the land, and by the time he was 12, he was keeping the accounts for 3 of the neighboring farms as his after-school occupation, which Margaret found entirely satisfying and Henry found both amusing and characteristic. In the summer of 1896, Henry retired from the marshal's position after 10 years of it, and he did not do so because he was asked to or because the work had become too much, but because he had done what he set out to do, and the territory was, in the specific ways that mattered to him, more orderly and more just than it had been when he took the badge. And because he was 51 years old and Margaret was 45, and William was 6, and the farm south of town that Henry had been building in his mind for a long time was a real possibility now, and he wanted to build it. He told Margaret his thinking on a Sunday afternoon. She listened with the full attention she brought to everything important. "A farm," she said, "south of town, 20 acres, good water access from the river. The Milner property is for sale." He paused. "I have been thinking about it for some time." "How long?" she said. "For years," he said. She looked at him. "And you are telling me now?" "I wanted to be sure before I brought it to you," he said. "I did not want to propose something I was not committed to." "You are the most deliberate person I have ever known," she said, not without affection. "Is that a yes?" he said. "It is a very warm yes," she said. They bought the Milner property in the fall of 1896, and Henry began the work of building it into the farm he had carried in his mind. And it was not a small farm, and it was not a large one, but it was a good one, with space for cattle and horses, and the kitchen garden that Margaret expanded with the enthusiasm of someone who has been wanting more room for years. William grew up on that farm in the way that changes a person, with the knowledge of how land works and what it requires and what it gives back, and he was good at it in the particular way of someone who understands that patience and attention are the actual instruments of farming. Samuel practiced law in Caldwell and was known for the same directness his parents had modeled, for taking cases that other attorneys declined because they were difficult or because the client was not impressive, for being someone that people trusted. He married in 1898, a woman named Dorothy who was the schoolteacher's daughter, and who had the good sense to appreciate what she was getting and the independence to be a partner rather than a decoration. And Henry and Margaret liked her enormously. Ruth came home from medical college in Philadelphia in 1904 and established a practice in Caldwell that was, at first, regarded with the skepticism that a woman physician received in 1904 in Kansas. And then, as people discovered that she was exceptionally competent and entirely unintimidated by their skepticism, with something approaching gratitude. She delivered babies and set bones and diagnosed the kinds of things that went undiagnosed in small towns, because there was no one competent enough to recognize them. And she did all of it with her mother's precision and her father's steadiness. Henry and Margaret were married in November of 1879, and by November of 1904, they had been married for 25 years, which occasioned the town of Caldwell marked with a dinner at the hotel that Henry had not anticipated, and that Margaret had clearly known about and not told him, which he found characteristic and funny. Samuel gave a speech that was precise and warm and funny, and that made Margaret cry quietly in the way she cried, without fuss. Ruth gave a toast that was shorter and more direct and equally affecting. William, who was 14 and not yet entirely comfortable with public emotion, sat next to his father and watched everything with attentive green eyes. Henry stood up at the end and said simply that he had gotten very lucky on a spring day in 1879, when a woman had walked into the land office at exactly the wrong moment, and that everything good in the 25 years since could be traced to that single chance encounter, and that he intended to spend whatever remained in the same company. Margaret, sitting beside him, reached for his hand under the table, and he held it without making any production of it, which was precisely correct. They walked home from the hotel through the November night of Caldwell together, which was cold and clear with the stars very bright overhead, the same stars that had been over the Kansas plain when they first arrived here, and that would be there after everyone in that hotel was gone, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And Margaret walked beside Henry with her hand in his and the breath coming in small clouds in the cold air, and she felt, as she had felt on that porch in 1886 with perhaps even more certainty now, that she had been given everything. The farm south of town and the house on the edge of Caldwell, which they kept as a town residence for convenience, were both full in the years that followed with the particular fullness that comes from children who have grown into people and who come back with their lives and their questions and their own children beginning to arrive. Samuel and Dorothy had a son in 1900 and a daughter in 1902. Ruth, who had married a doctor named Elias Webb, whom she had met at the medical college, had 2 daughters in quick succession and swore she was done with the whole enterprise, then reconsidered in 1907 and produced a son. William married in 1910, when he was 20, a girl from a farming family named Anna who had grown up on land and understood it, and who fit into the family with the ease of someone who was always supposed to be there. Henry's hair went fully silver by the time he was 60, which Margaret found distinguished, and she told him so, and he said that she was biased, which she agreed she was. Her own dark hair went gray more slowly and in the particular way of some women, silver at the temples first and then gradually through the rest of it, and he found it beautiful, which he also told her. She said he was biased. He said he was. There were winters that were hard and springs that were uncertain, and the particular difficulties of farming in Kansas, which is a place that requires a person to be comfortable with the fact that the land is larger than they are and has its own ideas. There were years when the cattle prices were low and years when the weather was unreliable, and there were the ordinary griefs of a life fully lived, friends who died, the changes in a town and a country and a world that moves forward whether a person is ready or not. But there was also this, the 2 of them still on the farmhouse porch when the evenings were warm enough, with the sound of the Chicaskia in the distance and the wide Kansas sky going from blue to gold to purple overhead, and the sounds of the farm around them, and the accumulated weight of everything they had built together, which was not small. She thought sometimes in those evenings about the courtroom in 1879, and the man who had slammed his hand down on the oak table and said, "She did not do this, and I will prove it myself." She thought about what it had meant to her then, a woman who had stopped believing that anyone would stand for her, who had learned to expect that the world would take the easiest interpretation and be done with it. She thought about what it had set in motion, the weeks of work and the evidence gathered carefully, and Clara Sims's courage and the dismissal of the charges and everything that followed, the marriage and the children and the farm and the 25 years and more of a life she had not been able to imagine was available to her. She had told him this once, not in a sentimental way but plainly, the way they told each other things. "You changed everything," she said. "When you stood up in that courtroom." "I told the truth," he said. "That is all I did." "Henry," she said, with the patience of a woman who has been listening to this man understate things for many years, "you threw your reputation and your position into the fire for a woman you had known for 6 weeks." "I knew you well enough by then," he said. "You believed in me," she said, "when nobody else did. That is not nothing." He looked at her with those gray eyes that had never, in all the years she had known them, looked away from something difficult. "No," he said, "it is not nothing. You are not nothing." He paused. "You are everything." She leaned against him on the porch, the way she had leaned against him for years, and the evening came on over the Kansas plain, and the stars appeared one by one in the deepening dark, and the farm was quiet around them with the specific peace of a place that has been worked and cared for and lived in, and they were there together, which was the whole of it, the simple and extraordinary fact of it. Two people who had found each other in a difficult moment and had chosen, day by day and year by year, to remain. In the long catalog of the things that the wild country of Kansas had seen in those years, the cattle drives and the settlements and the disputes and the violence and the beauty and the endurance of it all, here were also these two people, on a farmhouse porch in the evening, old friends and still in love, with the evidence of their life spread out around them in the form of children and grandchildren, and work done well in a place that was genuinely home. Margaret took Henry's hand. The stars came out fully over Kansas. The night was clear and wide and full, and they were, both of them, entirely, finally, wholly at peace.